Welcome to Perspectives with Mzu.
Welcome to Perspectives with Mzu. My guest today is Ms Noxolo Kahlana. She has a very rich background in CSI, corporate social investment, in the mining sector, the energy sector, in particular renewable energy. She has a total of 12 years of experience in the corporate sector. And she's an entrepreneur in her own right, having started Energy House in 2014, a company that does a lot of work to support IPPs, the independent power producers, and the mining industry on sustainability issues. She's also part of a group of professionals who put together a private equity fund in about 2017, about a year ago. And they have a target of raising a pipeline of projects worth R1 billion. So this podcast is part of a series that we're doing on women in business. And Noxolo has a rich profile. Welcome, Noxolo.
Thank you very much for having me, Prof. I'm looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, perhaps the best place to start would be to tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you start this journey? What attracted you to, especially the area of sustainability, and what are some of the lessons that you drew from that journey? And also maybe give us a bit of a picture as a woman in the renewable energy space, as well as in mining.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I always see myself as a sustainable development activist. A rural girl who always sort of believed and hungered for something better for our nation and as a people. It was never like a full plan or something I foresaw getting into the energy space. My career started in management consulting, and I've always had a passion for youth development and women empowerment. And in my studies and the different companies I've worked for, when the country decided to launch the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producing Program back in 2011, I found it when it was introduced to me by one of the IPPs that was constructing about 2 wind farms in the Eastern Cape, and then they presented to me the level of community involvement and ownership in these projects. That's what attracted me to the sector. And then getting involved for over 2 years into it, I started seeing gaps on the involvement of women, especially when most of the IPPs during construction will always miss their obligations and targets as far as procuring from women-owned enterprises is concerned, especially in the first 3 rounds. Most of them, I believe, paid penalties for missing these targets and couldn't find enough women actually to procure from while they are constructing, especially the solar and the wind farms. And I saw that gap. That's why I even joined Southern African Women in Energy Efficiency to actually introduce these industries to women from tertiary level and hold seminars and mentor other young people to get involved, because it gets a bit intimidating most of the time when you sit in a conference of about 500 people and you can count with a hand or two the number of women in the conference, and that our voices get drowned even when we try to raise issues because we don't have the numbers.
And probably the panels are made up of men. They now call the men's panel or something like that.
Yeah, most of the time. There are instances where they will find at least one woman to represent women, but it's never above that unless it's a women in energy conference. And when it's a women in energy conference, we never seem to be dealing with the core issues that would actually bring economic power and breakthrough for women. We seem to be dealing with the barriers more than the actual content of business opportunities for women in energy and in mining.
We'll come back to that point because I think it's very important in terms of the kind of energy, I mean, the energies and the talents that women in business have tend to be directed at rolling up the stone that is suppressing them or blocking opportunities for them. But we'll come back to that theme. But just one anecdote. I've known you before you joined the Renewable Energy Company. But I recall around 2012 when I was doing a research in Tsitsikamma in the community there, and there was this construction of the infrastructure by independent power producers to generate energy from wind. And you were very much on the ground. I mean,
Yes.
that's one thing that struck me. You were working with the Tsitsikamma community on the ground. You were interacting directly with these communities. Tell us about that experience, working with communities on local economic development projects and creating shared value between this power producer company and communities who are far removed from, these how energy is generated and so on.
That was a very enlightening, actually, and enriching experience. At the same time, I remember when the developers of the project actually started selling the concept to the Minister of Energy. It was a former exilee who was in Finland and Denmark and saw these things work there and believed and remembered that he grew up in an area with a lot of wind. But the funny thing is, when the project was being developed, it's only then they realized actually this village doesn't even have electricity on its own. And the fact that the people... So Eskom had to make a plan so quickly because it was just going to look wrong because the actual power doesn't go to the community. It still goes to the national grid and everything. Yeah. So it wouldn't make sense to develop
all these wind,
a massive
power,
2 billion wind farms in a village that doesn't have power itself. It wasn't going to work. But then I also got to learn that the socio-economic base our people are coming from was very low. Yeah. There was a lot of empowerment and education and enlightening that needed to happen. I mean, even to get them to sign these agreements, these shareholder agreements that they're owning 15% of this project or 9% of this project. What does that mean? Where is the rest of the money to build this project coming from? When will dividends come? It was a lot of work because, I mean, there's even language barriers. That's why actually the company I was working for at the time, the IPP I was working for, needed somebody who can speak Xhosa because they understood in order to get the buy-in of the community and get them to sign these agreements, they had to sort of win their trust. Because remember, with the Tsitsikamma project, and this was a community that was dispossessed before. Yeah. So their trust levels were really, really low. So they needed somebody with less barriers with them in order to talk to them. So it was a very humbling journey as well, because I didn't understand at first when the IPP said, we need somebody comfortable on the ground with the community, but also comfortable in the boardroom to present solutions to board members and everything in order to ensure that after 20 years of this power purchase agreement, this community is so well developed, it doesn't need external injection anymore. Then I got to understand the amount of work that needed to be done for these communities to even understand and let down their guard and realize it's not people coming to take your land again. This time it's people who are coming to partner with you in your development, and you can't be a passive participant in your development anymore. You have to be active in creating a sustainable future for your community. Yeah.
I mean, with this community in particular, I think the history there is that they were forcibly removed in the 1970s to make way for white dairy farmers or white farmers.
True.
And they were sent to an area that was not economically viable, in case Kamawuk. And there was demobilization of families and dislocation. And over 20 years later, now they were being regrafted to where they originated from, and older people were, there were people who were passed on, and the younger generation couldn't quite relate to this environment. I think also, there are many stories about how resettlement processes happened for people who were previously dispossessed, because this community was put back in, I think, over 5,000 hectares of land, the extent of the land, and were just expected to farm like
and thrive before.
The economy, the more empowered dairy farmers that were farming there. So it was quite a rich story. But maybe you could take us just go back to talk about the IPPs, because many people may not quite understand how these are structured. What are independent power producers? We hear today they're back in vogue. Eskom wants to procure power again from independent power producers. And society should know what these are, especially given the amounts of money that are involved in this process. I mean, when someone says in the 7 windows that were launched since 2011, we gained investments worth 200 billion rands. It could be difficult to comprehend how these actually work. Maybe just the IPP 101. How would you explain this?
Sure, that's a big one, Zu. I mean, our government crafted an independent power producing framework that has been lauded globally as one of the best in the world to attract investment into the country. And it was not going to make business sense for external investors to come and invest in this program, given how expensive these technologies were in the beginning. If our government didn't come with certain guarantees, with certain discounts, with certain rebates, and to make the investment very attractive. But also they wanted to make a balance so that this doesn't come at the expense of the country. And when they were evaluating these projects, when these IPPs were bidding, 70% of the evaluation was on commercial viability of the project, but on 30% of it was on the economic development obligations these project owners were supposed to adhere to ensure that this development benefits even people on the ground. And these economic development obligations were broken down into a preferential procurement from small businesses, BE compliant businesses, and women-owned businesses. And you would bid whatever percentage you felt made your project viable and made you more competitive. But also in these economic development obligations, because they were going to get 20-year power purchase agreements, they also needed to dedicate a certain percentage of their turnover over these 20 years to socio-economic development in the 50-kilometer radius of where their project is, as well as another percentage, depending on what the IPP decided to bid, on enterprise development. And that was the part that was going to ensure that this development trickles down and ensure that these communities are better off once the life of the asset is over. So IPPs would bid, they would go through an entire round of submitting their bids, evaluation, and go through a very lengthy process of financial close, actually, with a consortium of lenders, lawyers being involved, people representing the community trusts that have equity on these projects, as well as people who actually fund the community trusts, like your IDCs, PIC, Development Bank of South Africa. And there were specific requirements that the trust should be independent, the trust should have community trustee representatives. And from my perspective as a consultant to IPPs and looking at how expensive the program really is, actually, not only to the lenders, but also to the country. And I look at the socioeconomic spin-offs. I am struggling, even from job creation perspective. IPPs don't create permanent jobs. Most of the jobs are during construction, and they're seasonal. And they need very few people during operations. And I look at how much the program costs and how much Eskom pays to the IPPs and how much most of the money comes out of the country. And I trace, because I developed really authentic relationships with these communities, and I always check on them, even when I'm no longer working with them. How are things? What has been done since the project reached commercial operation? And I'm like, okay, we could have found a better way to develop our people. This program feels very expensive, and the socio-economic spin-offs are really not justifying how much this program is costing us. I know some people would find me and cut my throat for saying this, but having been there on the ground, it would break your heart how much most IPPs would do anything to make sure they do as little, as unsustainable as possible, just to comply, have their economic development report that's required by the IPP office, and get out of there. The economic development part of it is a necessary evil to them, but they just want to make their money and get out of here. That's my perspective. I may be wrong, but that's what I've experienced on the ground.
I would defer to you on this, because I have a high respect for you as an expert in the area, because I've seen your trajectory in the area, starting off as a CSI expert with Trialogue back when CSI was not such a popular thing.
I remember.
And also overseeing sustainability programs in vast organizations, big mining companies and big independent power producers. And also you have qualifications to back your authority, having done MA in Development Studies at Sussex University in the UK, and also an MBA at Gibbs. So I do think that what you have to say on this subject should be listened to. It would seem to me from what you're saying that the people who may have benefited a great deal from this program are lawyers, they are bankers, the subcontractors, the EPCs,
companies, and the international investors,
and the international investors,
wind turbine manufacturing companies, and your big solar panels manufacturing companies.
The social value is pretty thin on the ground. That's the sense I had as well, because I didn't spend as much time as you did in the community that you were working in, but I was researching at the time, the Zigama community, and I kept on thinking, and later on I happened to do a study for related to independent power producer for a government client, and it was very clear to me that there is fragmentary approach to in government. There are conflicting policy objectives around local content and around the ways in which government seeks to harvest benefits out of this. And just the idea that things can just happen on their own without effective monitoring and evaluation. Let's park this for now. I want to just get more sense on the particular barriers that women face in the area. You chaired actually the Women in Energy Association.
Yeah, the Southern African Women in Energy Efficiency.
Efficiency, yes. And just from your conversations there and also what you've observed, what were the conversations like, and what are some of the barriers to one entry to the sector? But having entered the sector, barriers to success, how much do old boys networks create barriers in the industry, but also the threat posed by, if you have black women coming into a sector that was dominated by a middle-aged white male, and also with black male who are starting to cut into the cake, and your imagines may just very well take their cake out of their mouth in their perception. What was your own observation and feeling about the place of women in the sector?
I think one of the obvious barriers to entry in the sector, not only for women, but for small Black local businesses as well, is how much the program or the project costs. The bidding process alone could cost you as much as 12 million without you being aware or sure that whether you'll get the project or not. That's just the amount you need to set aside for the advisory, the agreements, and getting all the licenses required to go with your bid and everything. Just the bidding process alone shut out any small local businesses because we don't have access to that kind of money. So a lot of Black small businesses, whether women were involved or not, that participated in these projects in the beginning came in as minority equity holders in the projects. And the sad thing is most of them were not even actively involved in the building of the project and making the decisions and everything. They were more like, equity partners that are always ready and consulted when agreements need to be signed and get very demanding actually when the dividends are ready. And the international investors that came on board, they didn't really buy into this transformation agenda government was trying to sell to them. And unfortunately, every time our government negotiates with international investors, I always feel we negotiate from a powerless point of view, I feel powerless is actually a mild word. I'm hoping for a stronger word. We
grovel.
We grovel when we supposedly have the power, the upper hand. I always have this philosophy. If a foreign company comes into your country and doesn't comply with the laws of the land, you can't blame that company.
I agree. That's my view. Yeah, that's also my take.
My view. So I think our government, in one way or the other, fails the nation or local businesses when it comes to ensuring that these agreements benefit local people, using our transformatory agenda and our Black economic empowerment commitments. So if our government doesn't take transformation seriously, how do we expect foreign companies and international players to
take a country like China. China has insisted to investors in the Chinese economy that they enter into joint ventures and transfer technology. Yeah. Because that's more sustainable rather than having one or two equity partners that are holding minority stake with no possibility for broadening that benefit to communities that need to be empowered. Just to think creatively and more innovatively about how to engage. Because if companies are coming to your country to invest, it's not because they are doing you a favor. It's not an act of charity. It's because they know that they can make great returns. Of course, there's something to be said about policy certainty, that we need to have clearer policies. We need to have certainty in our policy and regulatory framework. But we do need to harness these opportunities, these investment opportunities for the development of South Africans. And we don't have a sense of strategic investment promotion framework when we engage with investors. It seems, we're so desperate, and any investment is a good investment, even if it would degrade the environment or disadvantage communities. So I fully share your perspective.
Yeah, there. No. I agree with you there, Mzu. And when it comes to the limited number of women who are involved in the sector, I've been in it for 6 years, and I keep observing from a distance that men are comfortable working alone. Yes, you attend these conferences and you engage with them, but you are very easily dismissible because, don't you know where your place is? It's like, it's in our culture, even though it is not said overtly, but that's the attitude you get, that can you just know your lane? Can you stay in your lane? This is our world and it was created for us. When we need you, when we need a catering company to provide food on site and everything and accommodation, we will talk to you. But but also impressingly so, though, I must say, there's a number of IPPs I've noticed who would have female project managers for an entire solar plant construction, but it wouldn't be a Black female local person. It would be a young, amazing girl from Germany or from Denmark or from, which one is Spain? Yes, or Italy and everything. I haven't come across. The Black females would be more your economic development managers, and their departments will be severely under-resourced, so that they are not even able to spend the little budget that gets allocated to them per year to spend on those communities, forever, traveling these very long distances between the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape, and even limited budget to actually bring consultants on board to support them. Like it's just like the design is more often than not to frustrate them into thinking, you know what, this is not worth it because this is just a thing on the side for these developers. This is not something they committed to. And I think we shouldn't blame our government alone on this one, because even local South African companies show this disdain and half-hearted commitment to transformation. It would take corporate activists to assist government in monitoring and ensuring that transformation reach the obligations that are needed in order to create sustainable jobs in the country. And I keep telling people, for example, the unintended consequence of not taking transformation seriously. I keep telling people, if you just look at youth unemployment alone, I know it sounds like a cliche or anything, but we are sitting on a ticking time bomb. And we're not talking about uneducated young people who never went to school. We're having an unacceptable rise of graduates that are sitting with placards at street corners asking for jobs. And that's an indictment in a country that keeps saying that only small businesses are going to create the type of economic development we need. Only small business are going to create the jobs that are needed by this economy. And yet we're playing lip service into supporting and funding small businesses and ensuring that big business does business with small business, because one of the reasons entrepreneurs don't last over 3 years, mostly in this country, is because big business doesn't want to share the pie. They would rather sit with subcontractors they've always trusted and always done business with, because they don't want to take the risk of doing business with small business, and small business can't afford the security and insurance that is needed in these big contracts. When government is sitting with funds that every year go back to Treasury for being underspent, and we have entrepreneurs going Basque. Is it Basque, the English word? Mostly from lack of funding, late payment mostly by government, and not getting enough contracts from big business, because big business would rather do business with bigger contractors they are used to or have established long-term relationships with. So it's like nobody is calculating the cost and the risk of the high unemployment in this country and what it would do to the environment of doing business. I know people see this word very often on social media, that the country would be ungovernable. And it's not good to use traits sometimes to get people to be present and conscious and say, if we do not do this and pay attention to this, we will not have a country to do business with, because people are getting restless and are getting tired and are starting to think they're supposed to take matters into their hands. I mean, I had a project last year I have to share. with Pan-African Resources in near Secunda. And we were locked up in sight by militant local business people 3 times in 1 month, demanding opportunities, saying they're tired of being hungry. And they were willing to say, you will see another Marikana here if you don't give us a contract. And that was hectic. We had to add police, evacuators from there and everything. And those instances are growing, and we're not calculating the cost to productivity, to the future of the country, to the future of doing business in this country. It's like we're thinking our high-rise walls will protect us enough when the poor are really hurtful and saying, you know what, we've got nothing to lose anymore. We will make sure that you do not enjoy even the comforts you already have.
Yeah, that should be enough to raise our level of consciousness on these issues. And my view has always, and I've been consistent on this, that the reason why government is hard on business at times around transformation is because business has waited for government to be hard. If there was enlightened self-interest on the part of business, there would not be a need for transformation scores, for BE scores. Business would have put in place voluntarily mechanisms to undertake transformation projects to drive equity, because it's a necessity. And also the other cost, of course, is the fact that the reputational capital of the private sector in South Africa, especially big companies, is very low. People don't trust big business. They don't think business has the interests of society at heart. And then you hear all these scandals on Steinhoff or Christo Wiese, with tax affairs, the SAP or McKinsey, KPMGs, or mining safety. The list is endless. And I think business should wake up. I mean, you do find, if you look at, for an example, when we're dealing with questions of corruption, say under Jacob Zuma, you had a whole country behind this Zuma must go, and everyone was talking the same language. We're tired of corruption. These corrupt leaders must go. But when it comes to transformation, everyone goes to their own corners. Either they're defensive of their privileges. They don't want anything to do with working with Black South Africans. They would rather import skills abroad instead of cultivating skills that are here, or creating opportunities for the skills base here. But also another flip side or dimension rather to this, the point that you spoke about, where you said men are comfortable in environments where they are by themselves and women know their place. We've bashed middle-aged, grey, white men a lot, but I do observe that it's the same attitude with Black men. We are very vocal about racism. And how we need a space in the corporate sector or in the economy. But it would seem that we lack consciousness of opening up those spaces for women.
It's spot on, Mzu. Our African men, you don't want to touch patriarchy to them. And they're as a barrier to women's full participation in our economy. They don't want to address that at all. And the funny thing, I remember arguing with a person on this one, that if you don't want to address this, then you're not helping the majority of women in South Africa, because the majority of the women in South Africa actually are faced with patriarchy more than with racism. Actually, both in the home front and in the workplace.
Can you say something? Can you say a bit more on that?
Very few of Black women in South Africa, your ordinary Black women, have to work in spaces where they interact a lot with the other race. It's your professionals and higher up sort of executives that are in those spaces. And so if you're gonna assist women to ensure that they are independent, have full participation in the economy and reach their potential, you have to deal with patriarchy first. before you even get to racism, because mostly the women that have racism as their barrier are actually able to speak for themselves most of the time. And those who can't are those that are facing patriarchy on a daily basis in their lives. Yeah.
I mean, made a point that it begins at the personal space, which is at the home front. You could almost see the structures of patriarchy extending themselves from the work space, be it in government or in the corporate sector, right, to the home, because the conditions there are such that the woman is expected to do or to take on much more on the home front, to have the time and the space to empower themselves, but also to be able to extend their potentialities much more in the formal sectors of the economy. So they may not be able to compete with their male counterparts on the same footing because they are settled with a lot of stuff at home that a man at home would not take on. And then the man at home competes in the workplace to get ahead in promotions or in bonuses, in recognition.
Because they're not carrying the same load women are carrying.
Exactly.
But the funny thing, though, which I think it's important for us to highlight, in some instances, especially in the higher LSMs of our society and the upper class levels, I believe, and I've seen many examples, that it's actually more women than men who keep patriarchy alive. If it wasn't for women doing what they're doing to other women, patriarchy wouldn't have lived this long in certain elements of our society. So I feel women have a role and a responsibility to take as well in owning their power and using their power effectively in supporting each other. Because more often than not, you see us pulling each other down than supporting each other. And I know some people feel there's no data to support this, but I completely believe men support each other to succeed more than women support each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite an important point you make there, which some would argue that it's part of the structural feature of an environment that is created to benefit men, and being few women there to fight this patriarchy and to be able to make a headway, say as an executive, it's hard work to get there, and it feels a bit too much to be kind of carrying the load of everyone. But I get your point, and I'm more interested in how we deal with the primary elements of this, which is the reality that in women, for an example, are finding it hard to break into male-dominated industries. How do we change this without placing too much burden on women's struggles? Because those have been continuing. How do we change mindset in society? How do we convince men to understand that this is also in their best interest? Because in order to have a highly productive economy, to multiply the pie, to create genuine and sustainable prosperity, you need both brains.
Yes.
You need the richness of diversity. You need to harness talents across the cross-section of the population, both men and women, and that in the future, this could just very well benefit their sisters or their children, their daughters, and that it would make the world actually a better place than it is. How do we change the mindset?
I hear you. I think the start there would be legislation and regulation. It would be a start, because when Kenya said 30% of all government procurement and it would be to women and young people, and they were unwavering about it and ensured government leads by example, they started seeing a difference in that. So regulation and legislation would be the start. But the second thing that we would need to do actually I think we would need to be honest with ourselves as a continent. We haven't calculated the cost that our culture and religion actually has had in delaying the full participation of women in the mainstream economy. And we haven't packaged how much this has cost us as a continent, because it has. And we choose not to package it in a well-informed statistical business case that says, look at nations that have had women as leaders and how far they are in their human development and in their growth as nations, and look at our growth and development as a nation and as a continent, and the lower participation of women. And there's enough research to show that women leaders actually bring more profit to business than their male counterparts.
Yeah, I've seen studies by, I think the Harvard University and some other management schools, and these are robust cases that are well supported.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be the second thing we need to do to quantify the cost of not having our women fully participating in the mainstream economy in all industries, especially strategic industries. And the third thing, I think, for me, is an advice mostly to women, is that we have to be honest and make peace with the fact that we cannot empower and develop women to their full potential if we do not partner with men, mostly because of the head start men have had in not only in our continent but globally, and the fact that they hold the key positions. We cannot continue to have women-only women empowerment conference and talk to each other when we know more often than not our fate lies in the hands of men, especially in the private sector and in government.
And what would you say is the role of successful business women in taking on the role of mentoring, the role of hand-holding? I know that mentoring is quite a contested concept. It's often misunderstood. It has, different, it evokes different, perceptions. And some people don't like that word. Perhaps to frame it as productive relationship building for, say, for economic or career success.
The barrier to most women making themselves available actually to bring other women up with them, firstly, is some women are comfortable in the I am the only woman syndrome.
Or I'm the only African around the dinner table.
Yes. Some are, but sometimes as well, they have so much on their plate because they're in the minority. They just do not have the capacity to bring others with them. They just don't. And I personally, from my own experiences, I would rather be helped by a man to get there than another woman. I wouldn't want to put that burden on her. I would rather craft my own relationship and a psychological contract and be assisted by a man to navigate my way up to that table and make sure I stay and make sure I get assisted in bringing in policies that make sure that women have things as simple as an early childhood development center in the company, like within the companies who have already started doing that. I think your net banks and everything, those things that prevent women from leaning in, as Sheryl Sandberg says, companies have the authority and power to make sure that the environment is easier and enabling for women. And the only people who can make a dent in those policies and changes are actually the men that are already in power, because they are the majority more than the women, because at the moment they're still in the minority and don't have the muscle to shift things around. So the burden of mentorship, I would still put it more on the man. But I know there are other unintended consequences with that, things like sexism and harassment. So we have a lot actually to work through just to get to a point where women and men find a way to form healthy partnerships in building not only companies, but the nation together.
That's quite a perspective, I must say. I have never thought about it
Really?
that way. I've been as guilty for not availing myself for that role because of the awkwardness of, say, building a mentoring relationship with a woman. I was part of I think it was Alan Gray Orbis Foundation, and I always sort of wanted to rather mentor a boy because I thought it would be easy, and that unconsciously I thought there are many women who can mentor other women and so on.
Not really.
And also you don't want to put yourself in that position of, which is why the word mentoring is kind of weighty, because it has a kind of a patriarchal ring to it as well. It is, or rather paternalistic ring to it, that you are the possessor of knowledge. Although I must say, to their credit, the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation designed the program to be a mutual learning program. So they even the kind of support they give you to fully play your role. And then there were men who were mentoring women, but we don't have learnings out of these mentorship program to tell us a story of how, sort of documented story of how mentorship happens across genders.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Mzu. And I think there are very safe and ways to do this with boundaries that are hardly explored in companies. And I'll just use one example. When a CEO decides and set himself a target that I'll be a sponsor for young women to actually be accelerated in this company. And I'll make sure I drum it on my executives that you're going to go to your downline, your reporting line. And every month at Exco, you're going to expose 1 or 2 young women that you see talent in, and make sure that Exco and the board knows about them and tracks their growth into this company, and I expose to opportunities that are going to force them to go. You don't need to have a relationship with those people, but you need to make that decision that this is what I want to see, and this is my KPI, and every single month at Exco, I want to see one young female professional presenting something in solving the challenges of this company and coming with solutions. And we're going to track their growth in this company. And if they have challenges, we want to know. If they have barriers, we want to know. It's just being intentional that this is the cost of women not coming fully on board, not only to the company, but to the country as a whole. And we're going to be part of the solution. We're not just going to be absorbed in our world just because we're doing well, and not have a long-term visionary view of how our company plays a role in the entire development of the nation.
Yeah, it seems that the struggle ahead is still quite steep. It's a long way to go, but there does need to be a sense of urgency. I think something's got to be.
I mean, I remember during the Thabo Mbeki lecture early this year in May, it was done by Mama Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka.
Yep.
And she shared such a sad stats with us. She's like, if things go as they are at the moment, it will take Africa 52 years to reach gender equity or to mainstream gender according to their own targets. The African Union has their own targets of what they want to reach as far as gender equity is concerned. But at the rate we're going, not being intentional and forceful and accelerated, it will take us 52 years to get there. And the more women do not their potential not used fully into building our economies as an African nation, the longer it will take for us to reach where we need to go as a continent and as a country. And because we haven't quantified how much really women are needed in our society, and how much we self-sabotaging by not using their potential fully, the longer it will take to reach our own Millennium Development Goals.
Sure, that's quite sad and disappointing. Very, quite grim story. But just to circle it back to questions around community development, the best models to undertake to create social value, social impact, using these massive resources and this opportunity of investors with deep pockets coming to build this infrastructure here. And that generates a lot of value for many layers that are involved. As we said, the lawyers, the bankers, the EPC constructors. I think it's engineering, procurement, and construction. Essentially the subcontractors who build components to these infrastructure, major, massive infrastructure programs. Just matching your years of experience, thinking about CSI, corporate social investment, doing it, advising on it, and seeing it not working well. If you look back and where you are at now, and you're advising both government and business on how best to create sustainable social value in a sustainable way, how should we do social investment? How should we create social impact in ways that generates multiple positive multipliers in society?
Okay. I'm glad you asked that question, Zu. I think the first thing we need as a country is a plan. Our country doesn't have a plan for the nation's development. We need a proper, not the NDP, a proper 10, 20, 30-year plan of how the country should develop. We need, because the biggest impediment to sustainable development that has an impact in our country is the lack of collaboration, is the lack of very effective public-private partnerships that work, and even collaboration amongst private sector partners on their own. What we need as a country is to know very well what are our strategic assets and what are our strategic crops, what grows well in our country, which areas, and focus in our development. We say we have a map. These are our low-hanging fruits. These are our medium-term goals. These are our long-term. And we concentrate resources to one area until we reach what is planned. For example, let me give a practical example. If the best oranges or the best citrus fruits in this country for all retailers should come from the Eastern Cape, and let's say Woolies or Pick n Pay or anything cannot get those oranges from there because of logistics. The logistics makes that expensive. They would rather import because importing is cheaper. And we have so many development agencies in the country that could partner to make sure that cost of logistics is lower for retailers and make sure that area resources are concentrated in that area, and make sure everybody gets citrus fruit from there, because the best citrus fruit in the country comes from there. Same as, for example, the best beef and everything, and also have a similar plan for education. We all know how much crumbling our public education system is. And I don't know why we haven't decided as a nation that at the moment we need more technical skills than your normal conventional education, and why there isn't this massive national drive to let our kids specialize early so that they are internationally competitive to a point that we would actually export knowledge workers, not import all the time. Yeah. So we don't have a workable plan as a country, and we don't force collaboration on the areas which are our competitive advantage. That's what we need at the moment, where we would concentrate on in an area and make it an enclave until it succeeds and we move to the other. The lack of collaboration, both amongst private sector and even within, even government works in silos. You will see what the DTI is doing is not really supported by the Department of Small Business and the requirements they require in order to fund SMMEs, you sit and watch the requirements and you're not talking to the population you have now. You're actually targeting the population you wish you had. Can you just be realistic and honest about the kind of entrepreneurs you have and go to their level and grow with them and partner with them properly with well-established businesses until they get there? But we think saying to them 3 years audited financial statements, this
it's
and that.
Crazy.
I mean, it is. And on all these conferences, our cries to the FDIs, it's not FDIs, it's DFIs fall on deaf ears. It's like when you let people who've never run business before run a fund for small businesses, you're setting yourself up for failure. They have no clue what it takes to really build a business in this country, and they do not have the sense of urgency required to ensure entrepreneurs have an enabling environment to grow. They don't know what actually gets affected when you delay an entrepreneur's payment by 7 days or 3 days or 15 days or 90 days, because that's how bad government is in paying entrepreneurs on time.
Yeah, so, many would share, your stories. Development finance institutions are, they disembedded from the real economy of small and medium enterprises. And this payment delay of 7 days, a government bureaucrat only needs to see this from their perspective. If you were to delay a salary of civil servants by a day, many of them would commit suicide. But they don't think that that you need that to feed your family or to build your business, to get yourself to take care of your well-being. They don't see it as a salary, as an income. But when it comes to their own income, they would have palpitations if just a day, let alone 7 or 30 days.
It's an entire mindset shift that is required, actually, which will take us a while, given the society we're becoming. And the other cost we need to quantify as a nation and a continent as a whole is the real cost of corruption. If we would unpack that and put it in numbers.
That's a subject for another day.
I know, but it is a huge cost to small businesses too, actually, because it takes a lot to be able to do business with our government. Honestly, at the moment. You have to be willing more often than not to sell your soul to the devil in order to have a profitable business with government in our country.
So sad. Let's leave our conversation there. Okay. Wonderful podcast. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
For anyone who has suggestions of future podcasts that we can do, or you have comments on this podcast, my email address would be at the end of the podcast description. It would be just below the actual podcast. Until we chat again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Perspectives with Mzu.